I hit the right button. We do record these sessions. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to Continuing Professional Education's hot topic this morning on the sanctity of the LSRP's professional judgment. I think we have a good program today. I'm Phil Brilliant from Continuing Professional Education Services, along with George Berkowitz, Dr. Berkowitz, my partner with SEEPS, as well as Julianne Masago, the Director of Operations, here this morning. This is a open format, a Zoom meeting format. So what that means that you can mute and unmute yourself. I would ask you, however, that you do mute yourself, and you can turn your camera on if you want to. That's your choice, only because it gives the speakers the opportunity to be able to speak and not to be interrupted. If you do have questions, comments, concerns, anything you want to do, put it up in the chat. Raise your hand and we'll make sure we get your questions and comments addressed. We're going to do a couple things a little different. I'll let George explain that in a second. But before I do that, I did put in the chat, and I'll do it again. It is the Google Doc that we need completed for your registration today. This is a 1 credit approved course from the LSRP board. It's 1 credit because we're going to do this in 1 hour. And that's my job to keep us on time today. And again, certificates for that 1 credit will go out next week. If by some chance somebody is really 1 credit short for their license renewal and needs that tonight for some reason, let us know and we will get it to you tonight. But I'm hoping that the 1 credit is an extra credit for you and not your soul to getting over to your renewal. With that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. George Berkowitz, let him introduce the program and the other very distinguished speakers.
Thanks, Phil. Good morning, everybody. Let me thank Andy Robbins and Steve Sr. and Phil and Jules as well for being here. Quite frankly, I was hoping for better turnout. I don't think there's anything more fundamentally important to the LSRP community than how DEP either allows us to assert our independent professional judgment or mitigates our use of independent professional judgment. And it happens, theoretically can happen almost any point in the process, not just permits, but permits seem to be the remedial action permits, which is for any site that's not remediated to unrestricted use. The holy grail is the RAO, and you don't get an RAO until you get a remedial action permit approved. And what we're I shouldn't say that. What we're hearing and what my perception is, and that's one of the reasons we're having this, is to better understand if my perception and our perception, the 4 of us, is accurate, that independent professional judgment is being second guessed by DEP periodically, if not routinely. So the question then becomes, how prevalent is this? How much of a deterrent is this for functioning LSRPs? In fact, being an LSRP is a daunting responsibility. Just read your certification. In addition to that, when you sum up all the guidance documents, it's not just the 30-some technical guidance or the 20-some technical guidance, but add the administrative guidance and add the financial guidance. There's 91 guidance documents that we're responsible for. And it's really important for us to be able to actually affect the mandate of SARA to allow LSRPs to do the work and use their professional judgment and justify it every step of the way, having variances, the ability to have variances, having the ability to deviate from guidance, as long as you assert your independent professional judgment, which you're doing all the time, by the way. There's nothing new. So we're trying to get a better handle on this. I am trying to get a better handle on this. Steve is interested in doing this. Andy's interested in doing this, and Phil is, obviously, or we wouldn't be here. Because the question is, if this is more of a common perspective based on reality, what do we do about it? And that's a big question. And that's why we're giving you questionnaires today. You're going to have 1 questionnaire at the beginning, which we're going to ask you, it's going to be posted during the beginning, and you can fill it out during the course of our discussion. Give me a worst case scenario. Give me a worst case scenario that you had with a permit, remedial action permit. At the end of the day, give me your best case scenario. And somewhere I'm trying to get a handle on how prevalent it is for DEP to unthinking, in many cases, because they just don't have the information. They just don't have the understanding of the program. I don't know. What are the root causes of us in terms of our perception? And is our perception real? And the perception is that professional judgment is being mitigated. Now, I keep saying, and I say it somewhat facetiously, that's illegal. You're not supposed to be able to mitigate the independent professional judgment of an LSRP as long as that judgment is justifiable. And theoretically, it's a violation of the code of conduct. So I'm waiting for somebody who doesn't have a vested interest in staying in New Jersey to file a complaint against the department for mitigating their independent professional judgment. And Steve is smirking. I see Steve smirking. And Andy's fell out of his chair, by the way. But at any rate, that's the purpose for today. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce you to our panelists, Andy Robbins, Steve Senior, and Phil. We're going to spend, and by the way, Phil, this is an open mic, right?
It is, yep.
And if you have points, and I don't, obviously we have some time constraints. 1 hour does not do this justice, this topic justice. But on the other hand, if you have something really important that you want to say, don't be shy. We're trying to get information here. We want to try to understand if in fact this is a real problem. And if it is a real problem, what do we do about it? That's palatable to all parties concerned. And that's going to be difficult. So with that, I'm going to introduce Andy. Andy's going to be our first speaker. And Andy, it's all yours, buddy.
And Andy, as you turn on your mic, I'm just going to say that I am going to launch the first part of our questionnaire. It is, I ask you to fill it out and hit submit. It is 10 questions. You'll page down, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Sorry to interrupt.
This is for the worst case. The first one's for the worst case.
Worst case.
Your poorest experiences. I mean, it's hard not to have sessions like this turn into a bit of a gripe session, and that's not the intent.
Right.
Although I do believe that there is rationale for griping from what I've seen and what I've heard. The concern is that it appears that there's been less and less deference to the professional judgment of LSRPs in a myriad of ways. RAPs, as George pointed out, being probably the most specific example, maybe not the most extreme example, but certainly the most specific example. And I think going into the entire process of developing the LSRP program, it was recognized that there was going to be gray areas in a lot of remediation cases. It's not everything is cookie cutter, not everything is black and white. Excuse me, I knew I was going to suppress a cough and it would come out.
Andy's playing wounded, by the way, and we appreciate him being here.
Now I'm on my road to recovery, having tested positive earlier this week. But the concern early on, and it was evidenced by a change in the approach for the tech rules, that the tech rules and the discussions early on were, we're not going to create specific recipes. We're going to create a generalized cookbook with goals and overall focus rather than minute detail. And a lot of that was accomplished to some degree when the tech rules were revised. They went from a lot less prescriptive to a lot more goal-oriented or focused on those things with prescriptive elements in there. What I've seen, and I think many of you have experienced the same thing over the years, is that initial inclination to have prescriptive procedures and prescriptive requirements has made its way back in. It's a greater comfort zone for regulators to work from, very specific. Do you match this exactly? Do you fit into this box precisely? And the whole idea of professional judgment, besides the fact that it would allow cases to move forward in a much more coherent and rapid approach, was that the professionals would be able to sit there and say, I'm going to use my judgment to hit the goals, maybe slightly outside of what the box had been there before, or come to the same conclusion in a slightly different path. There isn't only one way of reaching a certain goal or reaching a certain conclusion. like, is there an engineering control that's protective of human health and the environment? And we've seen a divergence from that for over the years, a callback, a clawback, a return back, if you would, to the command and control concept of, this is the way to do things. You're not doing it the way we want you to do things. We don't need to listen to why you think it's okay. Let's move forward. And that's very concerning. And that's coupled with, from my perception, a lack of an interest in further dialogue by the department on a lot of issues, partly because it's just maybe they're overwhelmed, maybe they don't want to have dialogue, or maybe they're just tired of hearing the same other comments and rejecting them over and over again. So it's concerning, and there needs to be something done to adjust things back onto track, because I think the perception is that they're off track. I'll leave it there.
Steve? Steve?
Yes, sir. I'm back.
You're up.
I'm up. Thank you. I sort of know that a premise of this program is, as George started and Andy continued, that use of professional judgment, or in specific instances, professional judgment is, to use George's word, mitigated and diminished, right? Called into question. But I did want to say, and I found it interesting, every once in a while, this has surprised those of you who've listened to these programs before, George will say something surprising or interesting. And today, what caught my ear in his first mention was that mitigating professional judgment is illegal. And I to a degree, I think that's true. And I've written a lot about professional judgment and the statute and the rules since the statute, the Site Remediation Reform Act, was enacted in 2009. I wanted to share a couple of quotes with you. I won't spend too much time reading here, but this is a quote from DEP's rulemaking. The intent of the SRA is to allow LSRPs to make decisions regarding remediation of a site using their professional judgment, right in the New Jersey Register. With respect to the use of guidance, LSRPs have the ability to select an alternative approach if that approach is protective of public health and the environment. And sort of lastly, LSRPs should exercise their professional judgment regarding the level of detail needed to adequately justify their decisions. So, these are quotes, direct quotes from a 2012 rulemaking with respect to the Site Remediation Reform Act and those rules. And the view that professional judgment is, absolutely appropriate and, necessary in order to, practice in the site remediation area. In 2009, I wrote an article. The intention of the article at the time was, frankly, advocating to LSRPs that they needed to use professional judgment in, making these decisions, that site remediation can't be accomplished, without professional judgment, without, flexibility and room to exercise it. And I think, to me, that effort was successful. I think most LSRPs embrace the idea that they need to use professional judgment, that they need to be flexible in the application of rules and guidance, and that's what's necessary to get the job done. And we sort of bumped into, to use Andy's words, the sort of prescriptive approach of regulators and rules that has made the use of professional judgment more challenging. I like to say, anybody who's heard me speak about LSRPs probably has heard me more than once say, being an LSRP is not for the faint of heart. It's a hard job, really hard. This practice of site remediation is difficult. The answers are not clear. So I say, keep fighting, keep slogging, keep using professional judgment, defending it, working with your clients to arrive at the best site remediation outcomes. The science requires it, the rules allow it, DEP has recognized it. So, keep fighting. I suppose I'll pause there on professional judgment. We're going to talk about remedial action permits today too. That's a big area where, the use of professional judgment's important. And, we see a lot of pushback from the department in the cases that we're involved in, whether it's, a regulator saying, no, I think you should put a well there. Or, your monitoring program and inspection program should be different because, it doesn't match up the way Andy said with some of our requirements. So, we do see, those kinds of, I'll say infringement on professional judgment creeping in the permit program. And it's obviously a place where, at least in my view, there's room for improvement. And I think, that's one of, George's premises and, how do we get there? And so, hopefully today you will offer some comments, we'll offer more comments and answers maybe. Collectively we could think about how to continue to advocate best for the program, the use of professional judgment and improved permitting process to kind of meet the incentive of the Site Remediation Reform Act, which was to facilitate, improve the cleanup and redevelopment of contaminated sites. So we keep talking about that. I'll pause there.
Before I pass the baton to Phil, and as Steve has pointed out, RAPS is only one place that this could rear its ugly head. How many people have had technical consults where the department says, no, we don't agree with that? And I said, well, my professional judgment says that I can do this. Well, your professional judgment doesn't comport with my professional judgment. And I've had that happen at least twice and fought it and won eventually, but it wasn't pleasant. And I do believe that there is a trap when you go for technical consults. Don't ask DEP what to do. Tell them what you're going to do. Phil, it's all yours.
Yeah, just a couple of things. And I think it's important, to say, and, George didn't say it yet in his presentation this morning, but every time that I talk to him, he says it. When the department throws out numbers that say 92% of submissions, 88% of submissions are deficient, then, the problem is probably not on the people who are submitting, but, on the people who are doing the reviewing. With that said, I will say, however, having some opportunities for discussions with the department, my 2 points out to LSRPs are: one, if you are, submitting a document and you are submitting a document based upon your professional judgment, you are looking at all your lines of evidence, you have dotted your I's and crossed your T's, and you have satisfied delineation, and you feel that you have submitted the most complete document you can possibly do, stand by your work. Do not bend. Do not back off. If that is the document that you believe represents the remediation of that site, honestly, fight it to the end, okay? Because a lot of times, and I know it's one of the questions here, the department will tell you withdraw the document because of X, Y, Z. And in a lot of cases, LSRPs are withdrawing the document right there and then, okay? George just said something, and I will say it: technical consultations are for before you submit the document. When you submit your document, you've already made your decisions. And if you ask for a meeting then, honestly, the department's not looking to meet with you to review your document. They're looking to meet with you to review your process, to review the remediation you're going to propose. Do it beforehand. You are more apt. I know I've heard on occasions people are like, I can't get a technical consultation. Nobody will meet with me, okay? If it's before you submit your milestone document, I will tell you, you will get that meeting. If you don't, take it up a level. Do not be concerned about that. Because not for nothing, when you get a response back that says your document's not valid or they're questioning your delineation, they're copying everybody in the world. So there's no reason why you can't bring the people who are quote unquote the decision makers of the department right now, in early on. And I'll talk about the fact that most of the decision makers have now left the department. And the last thing I will say on that is when you submit your document and you submit a complete document, make sure you have looked at every page of that document. Okay. There's been a couple of occasions that, through some audit processing and doing some things that I work on at the board, and I'm not representing the board, but it's education that I've learned and I'm going to share it because I think it's important. The department, the new staff of the department looks at those documents. I was a firm believer early on that all they looked at was forms and never looked back. But if you remember now, the forms now we're asking for page numbers. The forms are really directing them in different places in the document. And there's situations where notes were included in a document and the notes contradicted the proposed remediation. And the LSRP didn't look at the entire document when it was submitted, but yet uploaded it. Know what you're submitting. George said it already. You're certifying it. You're responsible for it. So make sure you know what it is. That's my only bit of advice. George, do you want to share these questions or you want to keep going? How do you?
No, I want to keep going because there's some
Okay.
fundamental issues that I think we should talk about. First of all, the board exists not just to protect the public, not just to protect DEP, but to protect the LSRPs. I can't tell you how many times that we used to get complaints from DEP in the initial stages of our of the operation of the Site Remediation Reform Act. And we would just say, no, this is not a violation of the Code of Conduct. My question is, if in fact this issue is so important, does the board have a role in fixing it? Phil?
I take the fifth. No, I think the board has to play part to it. I think, but it has to be something that an LSRP brings to the board. I
Right.
don't think it can originate from the board level.
Well, Phil, I would tell you that you have 7 members theoretically on a full complement. You have 7 members who are LSRPs. And I think one of the reasons that's so is so they can monitor what's going on in the wonderful world of LSRPs. So I would think that, no, I don't necessarily agree with you. If in fact the board had evidence that this is a recurring problem, and that's why we're here, is to try to figure out whether this is a recurring problem and whether it really is causing people to be concerned about whether or not they want to be LSRPs in the future. But at any rate, I do believe that it's not necessary for somebody to go to the board and say this is a problem. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Phil.
No, I'm done.
Well, I'm sort of reminded of, the board's decision or process to try to define what professional judgment is.
Yep.
And, I never really supported that idea. I thought it was, frankly, too difficult a thing to do. And by sort of writing down, what is professional judgment, then we would be stuck with like a different rule about what is professional judgment. You'd have to comply with that rule. And, that would just create its own problems, sort of at the risk of making a joke, right? Like, I don't know, professional judgment's like pornography, right? I know it when I see it. Or when it's documented properly, clearly, transparently, using multiple lines of evidence that sort of fill in the gaps between the lines, don't leave DEP to have to read between the lines. To your point, George, I mean, you started with, well, what's the board's role? I could see the board playing a role in saying, hey, there's a problem here. And, collectively, we need to figure out how to get past that problem.
Mhm.
But, I'm, leery of the idea that, the board would define professional judgment or, with DEP, they'll define professional judgment, without, really, the input of the rest of us. And so I guess I think you make a good point that the board could call attention to the issue. And then, maybe we need sort of a broader discussion about, how does professional judgment get applied? And importantly, how does it get reviewed, right? Because at the end of the day, that's part of the issue. How are they looking at professional judgment and, making decisions about whether they like it or not?
I'd like,
Go ahead, Andy, it's all yours.
I'd like to briefly circle back to your question about the board's role, but I'm going to get there in a slightly convoluted way. Let's dig into the real implications of some of where the rubber hits the road on, or it grinds into the road, as you might put here, on these issues. Technically speaking, DEP has the authority whether or not to issue a remedial action permit. But a denial to issue a remedial action permit, from my perspective, and I think from most practitioners' perspective, is something to which you're entitled to an adjudicatory hearing. It's a final agency action. DEP may or may not agree with it, but there will be a challenge there. But let's get to the bigger sense of DEP asking for withdrawals of RAOs or withdrawals of RAPs. The practice of law can be easy if it were just the black letter of law, which is what you're taught in school, or you read the legislation, you go there. The art of law is trying to deal with practical advice and practical consequences at the same time. And the reality is the DEP does not have the authority to compel LSRP to withdraw anything. The DEP could take an enforcement action. And the opportunity to withdraw is often couched as, or we're going to take an enforcement action. And I'm certainly not advocating that people should, without careful thought and consultation with their clients, go ahead and provoke DEP to take an enforcement action. But at the end of the day, DEP's been trying to play the game of, we're going to rattle that saber of, we're going to take an enforcement action, whether it's a referral to the board, which is happening less frequently as far as I've seen, or trying to force you to withdraw a document, where it's to the point where on the individual case it makes sense to play along with DEP and go ahead and withdraw or revise or modify. But cumulatively, there's an argument to be made that DEP should be put to their proofs. The DEP should be compelled to take the enforcement action. The DEP should take that next step, which is what they're authorized to do, but they can't compel you to withdraw, but they can take an enforcement action, where then you get to defend yourself in a different forum. And I have a couple of cases that are, meandering their way through the adjudicatory hearing process in that context, and it's time consuming and it's inefficient and it's ineffective for the client. In most of the instances, it's really DEP hasn't given us an option. But DEP does not have the power to be able to fight in court, in my opinion, that their professional judgment wins over an LSRP's professional judgment. Courts tend to defer to the agency, but the legislation wasn't meaningless. The whole idea of the legislation is there, and that becomes a crisis. You want to call it an analog to a constitutional crisis that we've heard about so often in our government systems, where the LSRP board probably does have a role to sit there and say there's something that's heading to repeated enforcement actions, or DEP, using a very strong word, which is often inappropriate, but maybe appropriate sometimes, of, threatening unnecessarily LSRPs to do it their way, or blackmailing LSRPs, if you want to use the stronger word. And there's a point for the board to come forward and say, is there something here that can be done to change that framework? The reversion to prescriptive approach of reviews, and the lack of appropriate attention to professional judgment. And then maybe I'll save it for the end, but LSRPs can do a much more detailed job in their submissions. Phil's admonition about reading what you're submitting is important. Having a second set of eyes look at it, doesn't have to be an attorney, although, Steve and I will certainly advocate that there are many people in the practice who are quite competent, being able to provide good advice in a relatively discreet way, and a very discrete amount of time, really what I meant to say, to improve on that project. I mean, I'll use the analogy that when my eldest was going to graduate school in California and he wanted to be a resident in California because the tuition was far cheaper as a resident in California, there was a 15 part questionnaire to establish residency. I helped him with it. It ended up being 2.5 inches thick of attachments and whatnot, and probably overkill. But it went through the first time and we didn't have any questions or comments. And California is very focused on making sure that those applications are detailed because of the money involved. So there's something to be said about doing your homework up front, assuming the worst case scenario from DEP review.
We do have a question from the public. Mr. Ferguson? Unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Thanks. Andy, you bring up a point about compelling DEP to action, and Sarah was specific and ARCs are still specific, and that DEP can only invalidate a key document based on evidence that it's not protected.
Right.
They will rattle their sabers and saying, well, it may be misleading to the general public. The layperson won't understand the language in the RAO. But if you're going to challenge DEP, challenge them to invalidate it based on technical data. They can go collect data. That's what publicly funded does. Be prepared for what they might find if they do that. But if you're going to push them to actually, cite the grounds to invalidate.
Roger, I would appreciate the comment. If in fact you're interested in what's not protected by public health, safety, and the environment, it's in ARCs. 12 items in ARCs. Unfortunately, one's a pretty much of an omnibus, anything that's not protected by public health, safety, and the environment.
In their
Some of those issues, and the question is, why did they do that? So they could invalidate an RAO. Nobody can tell you what is protected by public health, safety, and the environment. But having said all that, Roger, thank you for your comments. Phil, you're going to say, I'm sorry, Andy, go ahead.
And we're going to get a new version of ARCs coming out someday. It's going to be fall of 2021, which might have passed. So it's going to come out at some point. But when they came out with the first version of ARCs, there was a section 6.4 that was focused on forcing withdrawals, forcing revisions that many of us commented on forcefully, and DEP dropped from the rule for a lot of the points that, George, you just raised. It's worth pointing out, and I expect them to do it again in the next iteration.
Go ahead, Steve. Sorry, I was maybe slightly change the direction or topic. One of the questions in the chat I'm finding really intriguing. Andy Huber's question about how many of these sort of disagreements about permits has resulted in referrals to the board, or let's say complaints by DEP. I know, Phil, I see that you answered it or tried to answer it, but some of us follow the board, and I'm not really aware of that many permit applications or that part of this process that has resulted in complaints to the board. A couple of you guys know better than I do, but I sort of wonder why that is. I mean, maybe it's because DEP has so much leverage in the issuance of the permits that they don't need to refer it to the board. They get what they want in the regulatory process in the first instance. I'm not sure where to go with the answer to that question or that question itself, but I think it's kind of interesting if it's true that DEP hasn't really referred many of the permit applications to the board for review or disciplinary action, that there's a process reason for that. And maybe even for some of us, it suggests, how the process maybe should change.
I want to follow up. I asked a loaded question. If this were a recurring problem, should the board be involved? First of all, the board, as Steve has pointed out, issued a statement of interpretation of what independent professional judgment is. And oh, by the way, the Attorney General never wanted us to issue those things because they said, well, now you're promulgating a rule without promulgating a rule. No. Massachusetts has had this since 1993, the ability to ask the board questions about technical issues or regulatory issues, and it worked out very well for them. Yet the DAG's office didn't want us to do it. My point simply is the board's taken a position already as to what's independent professional judgment. They need to follow through with it. And if in fact this is a widespread problem amongst our community, and that's what we're trying to find out, that's why we're having this session. If it's a widespread issue, I think we got to prod the board into saying, you told us what independent professional judgment is, and we're not being allowed to use it in certain instances. Okay, I'm sorry for the silence. Roger, you have any comment about that?
I was just going to say two things. So one, back to what Steve said. Again, I can't give specifics as being a board member, but I think what I tried to put there was that you can look at the board's website and see who the complaints are coming from. But it is clear, just based upon the number of complaints the board is getting per year, it has dropped dramatically. And the biggest submitters of complaints early on was the department.
Right.
And then the board became number two, with all of the, you want to call them mandatory timeframe tickets. And, but it has definitely dropped off. I don't have an answer as to why or what the department's intent is, but I would agree with what you said, Steve, is they have an avenue to deny a document.
Mm.
And, whereas when it was RI submissions and people weren't doing proper delineation or things like that, they were saying, get it in the RA. But in those situations, there were still complaints coming in, and we heard from people, well, they told me if I didn't withdraw my document, they're going to submit me to the board. And I withdrew my document, they submitted me to the board anyway.
Yeah.
So I think something has changed there. And then, back to what you just said, George, and the, the evolution of this program. And I know somebody made the comments, and I think it's Steve's words, so I'll give him credit for it. If it's not, you can take credit anyway. The erosion of professional judgment over the past few years. And I don't remember if that was you or not, Steve, but but I do think a lot of it is playing out today because, and you haven't talked about it yet, George, because of the change of leadership at DEP, because of the people who are reviewing permits, because of the lack of experience of the people reviewing permits. And the fact, and George, you say sometimes site case management at the department may not have been a bad thing all the time because people knew your cases and they knew the history. And now not only are people picking the sites up cold, but they just wrote their senior thesis in college and now they're reviewing your RAP and a permit application. And we lost a lot of institutional knowledge over the past 2.5 years. And I think that that's playing out a lot in what we are getting back from the department.
I did want to touch on Chris's question that was posed. The hearing that the department's concerned that if they accept his professional judgment or someone's professional judgment, it creates precedents that they're not comfortable with. I think there's, in a perfect world, an opportunity there for the LSRP to educate DEP or for DEP to understand why that precedent wouldn't be bad as long as certain criteria are met. But it's disconcerting that DEP is afraid to accept professional judgment. And that's how I interpret it.
Let me switch gears a little bit. Can we identify root causes if in fact this is a problem? And let's make the assumption that it is, at least from my perspective, it is. What are the root causes of this problem? Phil touched upon some of them, but what I am going to suggest and posit is that site remediation program has been insular. As you know, I served 8 years in DEP, and every division that I ran had an advisory committee comprised of professionals, comprised of PRCRs. Now, I know Mark is going to say, well, we meet with the LSRPA. That's not universal. That's not broad enough. And I don't believe that Mark is even entertained whether or not he should have an advisory council. I guess that's not even on his agenda. But my point is, when he comes forward, as Phil has said, and said we have 92% deficiency rate, that tells me that the program is not being managed. It shouldn't be that way. Whether you want to have classes of permits, not all permits are alike. Do you deal with them as on a basis of first come, first serve, or you deal with them on a prioritization? And do those different priorities have different levels of scrutiny? And then
George,
hang on, let
George,
me just finish. Let me just
sure.
finish. And then we get a remedial action permit guidance document. Oh, I was so happy to see that, because I thought for sure it was going to lend clarity as to how the department would deal with remedial action permits. And all it does is give us more and more mandates. And we don't know, I don't know how the reviewers are constituted. What are their qualifications? What is their training? And we have 91 guidance documents. How many guidance documents does the department have? Would a guidance document for the reviewers tell you how you should be reviewing these permits and making substantive issues, not just minor administrative issues? Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was going to jump in about 3 paragraphs back and I was on mute because there's something called the Site Remediation Advisory Group, right? And I know that's not what you mean. And I sort of, my own view is that the sort of functioning of that group is not the kind of advisory council that you were talking about. You know, probably a lot of reasons for that, but to me, that's an interesting idea that, you know, there might be some type of advisory council, for lack of a better noun. You know, how that would work, you know, like to hear that, how that could flesh out. But if you look at the Site Remediation Advisory Group, and I think, you know, that's the first thing you'd hear when you said, well, don't we need this, or wouldn't we benefit from this? You know, that group is too big and disparate and, you know, really more of a one-way communication street than the kind of council that you were talking about. So that's what I was trying to jump in on.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So, George, a question came up, which was a good one, and we're not going to go into site specifics, you know, but I know if I bring this up in generalization, you'll go off the deep end. You know, but it happens to be from you know, David. He makes a comment that, you know, he's being asked to withdraw an REO on the basis of not properly documenting that Berries Creek is not a sensitive receptor in the Meadowlands. And I know you've had issues. We have been battled with the department about the Raritan River, I believe. And you know, so I guess I didn't know if we wanted to opine on that or give a thought on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, quite frankly, that's a case where I had, and I hate to take up time going in site specific, so I'll try to make this brief. I had a case where we went to the department for a technical consult. The department was asking us to go into the Raritan River for garden variety PAHs. PAHs that we had anthropogenic determination by the department right by a discharge point. Let me say that again. The department determined that it was anthropogenic PAHs right by a discharge point, and we had the same PAHs coming off of our site. So at any rate, again, considered anthropogenic. They want us to go into the Raritan River. We had a technical consult and told them we're not going into the Raritan River. And they said, well, our professional judgment doesn't agree with your professional judgment. And finally, we had to kick it up to Mark. We had to hold the meeting in Giant Stadium. There were so many people involved. And eventually they came back and gave us a compromise, take 2 samples at the end of the pipe and see what you got. And we said, okay, that's a no lose situations. If we find it, it proves our point. And if we don't find it, it's not a problem. My point is that cost the client a lot of money. That cost the client a lot of money, but it was worth it to keep them out of the Raritan River. So it's not for the faint of heart. You got to be judicious in terms of when you play these trump cards. But that's the moral of the story. It can happen.
I knew you would bring the Meadowlands and Trump into this, so that's why I threw the question to you.
Well,
Steve?
like, let me jump in. I mean, just because I think that raising the sort of ecological issue is good. I think I'll just say, and I bet this experience is almost universal, that lately We've been seeing a lot of comments and issues raised in the ecological context. And old cases, new cases, all kinds of cases where, whether it's the ecological group, BERA has been very active, or there's something else going on. I don't know what the answer to that sort of question or issue is, but it is an area where I'm seeing a lot of technical questions being raised and differences in judgment about how a site ought to be evaluated and investigated. And I do wonder if, what are the reasons for that? Or do the reasons sort of, help us at all? I mean, ecological risk assessment is sort of a, technical, half science, half art, in terms of how it's applied and conducted. But I see it as an area these days where, especially at more complicated sites, the judgment of LSRPs is being questioned, substituted, fought over, and clients do wind up spending a lot of money to address it, usually for, little benefit to anyone.
So Bill Kraft raises a good point in the comments about DEP not wanting to overturn their prior NFAs even when shown to be deficient or in error. And there's a double standard, I would suggest, that DEP has with their prior work, and then looking for what I think Steve was getting towards, or what I perceive some of those comments to be, of a desire for perfection. On the concern that someone somewhere is going to overlook their shoulder and say, you missed this. Well, I mean, Bill points out that DEP won't admit when they haven't done something in the past. They want to call it a new discharge, partly because it's a hassle to try to rescind an old NFA. You have to go through a regulatory process to do so. But it's again coming to that point of, like, why is the pursuit of perfection being allowed when professional judgment has to hit a standard, an important standard nonetheless, of protective human health, but it's not a absolute guarantee of every possible thing. It's, has there been a reasonably diligent inquiry into the nature of the contamination and the manner by which it's being addressed? And we're not seeing that. And again, I think it comes back to that broader issue of the department not working with the LSRP's professional judgment.
Andy, you raise the fundamental problem here, that in my opinion, DEP is looking for absolute perfection on these RAPs, not understanding that at the end of the day, really what determines whether or not your professional judgment is appropriate is a protective of public health, safety, and environment. And if it's not, you have the right to overturn my RAO. And I think that's the point that you were trying to make, is that DEP has a second bite of the apple if we screw up. I'm not suggesting that we do, but they're looking for perfection, where absolute 92% deficiency rate tells the story.
But they don't want to take that point. It goes to Bill's point, Bill Kraft's point of, if there's an NFA which clearly is not adequate at this point, not saying something was done wrong or someone lied or there was a false submission, but there's information that's been developed since then that shows that that NFA as issued wasn't protective at that time. DEP doesn't reopen those. DEP doesn't go through that process of let's go back and revisit it. And I'm not saying they have to go through that rescission process, but there's a dichotomy there. There's a differential between what they're expecting in submissions from LSRPs today and their willingness to accept that, NFAs don't have to be perfect because we make decisions at the time based on our best judgment.
Well, without getting into case specifics, and quickly, I had a site that was closed, lagoons closed 32 years ago, predated NFAs. We got a letter, was never officially granted an NFA, reopened the investigation. 32 years ago, we had 4 letters from the department said, you're done. Finally, we won.
I'm launching part 2 section questions so that we keep the time going. These are the same questions you saw at the beginning of the program. However, they're asking you for your best case. because we've all been very positive through the past 45 minutes. We want to hear about the best case because there has to be some good examples. So we want to see that. So I just relaunched that aspect of it.
We have 9 minutes left. Does anybody from the audience want to say anything at this point in time?
There's been some chats going on about agreement on that.
So I guess, quite frankly, I've been taking notes. And Steve Senior said this just cannot be a rant, and he's absolutely right. The idea here is to gather information in the process of introducing a couple biases. But having said all that, what I have written down so far is A, putting together an advisory council, B, having guidance for the reviewers that stratifies the level of review based on complexity. C, bring this to the board's attention and spur the board on as to the fact that their interpretation of professional and judgment is being second guessed. Steve says, Andy's talked about ecological content. I will tell you, I agree with you. It's becoming more and more important. And that's what I have for the time being.
Roger, you have something to say?
Yeah, I'm thinking I'm going to flip this a little bit. And how do we take advantage of an opportunity to do some restructuring in the program because of the massive brain drain at DEP and the young untrained staff, and their obvious inability to manage their own program, which reminds me of how bad it was before Sarah. And I go back to a conversation we had with Mark Peterson when he first took over, and he asked, well, what should I do? I said, Mark, let half your staff go. Let us do our job. Don't get in the way. And that's exactly what they've done as a bureaucracy. So how do we fix the bureaucracy goes a long way to how do we fix the problems that everybody is talking about. And I think part of it, honestly, is new management at the top of site remediation. And without that, nothing happens. And there are rumors, but they're just that. You know, how does Gwen Service fit into the big picture moving forward? You know, where Dave Hames can be very reasonable when you get him. You know, but maybe they need somebody from the outside coming in to do an independent, clean look at the program and how it works and how it doesn't work. Because, you know, the way they moved people around was like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. The ship is sinking again by their own actions. They, you know, they can't manage the process they got. The sites that are in direct oversight, you know, how long does it take to get a adjusted ACO out of enforcement? I've got one guy that's going on 2 years now. That's insane.
Well, I think, quite frankly, there's some things that we can control and there's some things that we can't control. I agree with you that a change of perspective, not necessarily a change of personnel, but a change of perspective at the top of the site remediation program is absolutely necessary. And that may not mean that's necessarily a different person, but like any discussion, the person with whom you're making that discussion needs to be somewhat receptive to the process. I don't see that happening.
Not right now, no.
Somebody was going to say something.
Well, I mean, maybe to state the obvious, right? Like, I agree with you, George, a change in perspective, it would be really beneficial. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to, you know, then ripple that new perspective, if you will, down through the ranks and, you know, give them sort of the guidance and training to implement it. So, so that might well be the, you know, the best kind of outcome. But you know, as you said, there's things that we can influence and things that we can't.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a hard one.
Another observation, Mark's cachet is huge with this commissioner.
Mhm.
And this commissioner defers to Mark and whatever Mark says relative to his program rules. So some in a prior administration might say, maybe we need to go to the commissioner. I think that's not necessarily the path of that we would want to take at this point.
George, let me run real quick through just the results of our 2 surveys we've run.
Mhm.
People get the chance to see them.
Yep.
So this is the first one we ran. This is the worst case scenario. We didn't have 100% participation, but pretty close. You know, most people have submitted RAPs. You know, most people have not seen them to be promptly approved. If no, did the DEP reviewer ask you to review? Pretty much 50-50 split from those responding. Did the reviewer raise technical or regulatory questions? The answer is yes. Were the questions resolved to your satisfaction? Does appear to be yes. Were the reviewer willing to examine differences? Interesting to see. The answer is yes.
Yep.
Majority, yep. Again, close majority there. Did the reviewer mention DP enforcement or referral to the LSRP board? Interested to see. The answer was no. You know, but still 6 people saying yes. Was your reviewer well-versed in the technical and more no than yes, but pretty 50-50 split? Was your reviewer well-versed in applicable regulatory issues? Seems they're learning the rules, so that's good. And was your reviewer well-versed in the role of the LSRP's use of professional judgment? More people said no than yes.
Yeah.
You know, so on the best case scenario, because of course everything improved over the past hour, you know, have you submitted more than, you know, the answer is yes there. Prompt, again, no's more. If no, did the reviewer ask you to withdraw? Interesting, no. So the reviewers were more apt to work your best case scenario. Did the reviewer raise technical regulatory questions? Yes. Were the questions resolved to your satisfaction? Majority, yes. That's why it's best case scenario, sure.
Right.
Reviewer willing to examine differences? Yes, very good to hear. Did the reviewer mention DP, LSRP enforcement, stuff like that? No. Was your reviewer well-versed in technical? And the answer was yes. That's an interesting change from the worst case scenario. Be interested, we should have asked the question if they were the same people doing the reviews or different. Was your reviewer well-versed in regulatory? It seems yes. And was your reviewer well-versed in the role of the LSRP's professional judgment? Yes.
Good stuff.
Would be the best case scenario. I'd be interested to see if they were the senior reviewers.
Or simpler applications. And the other thing I'll add is, I realize it's a relatively small population, so the numbers could come out. There's still some of the answers were still negative in the best case scenario, even though it was a smaller percentage. It's still negative, and it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And the last two questions are up, and this is more about the process and the overall thought. And you know, just to get your feel on what we've talked about over the past hour and how possibly this program can be fixed. Because I don't think there's anybody who believes it doesn't need a fix. There's definitely something. So George, if you want to go into some closing statements with everybody.
I mean, look, again, the purpose for this is to try to figure out if this is a common opinion that the program is somewhat broken. I will tell you that Andy and I were on the original, Steve, I don't think you were on the original stakeholder committee.
He was there.
He was there.
Yeah, because we met.
Were you there, Steve?
We met in his office in
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Morristown.
Sorry, Steve. You're so young. I thought it was this all predated.
There you go. Thanks, George.
But at any rate,
But
Andy
yeah.
will tell you that one of the primary reasons that Irene Kropp was promoting for permits, or I think actually Andy may have come up with the idea about permit, is to keep track of engineering controls. That was it.
Right.
That was it. So what you see how that's morphed. Listen, I just want to say I appreciate this is the beginning of something, not nearly the end. And I don't even know, I hope it's the beginning of something because, you know, I need a life. I need a windmill.
Hey, George, I don't see the raised hand. I just want to make a comment. You know, one of the things that I see, and I think others could see, and it might be valuable to collect some of these experiences, is the inconsistencies in the application of professional judgment. Real quick. At the Newark Airport, the department allowed us to use site security, Port Authority police, fences, armed police, et cetera, for our engineering control. At Holland Tunnel, there's a police station right on the contaminated site. Wouldn't let us use it. At George Washington Bridge, there's a police station 24/7 right on the contaminated site. Wouldn't let us use it. It just is so inconsistent. It has made me crazy, but that's just a sample of that inconsistency.
Yeah. And put
I'm
you
sorry,
in
Dave,
mind.
There's better police in Newark.
what was there was there an effort to use a alternative remedy? Or it wasn't a presumptive remedy situation? Right,
It was not a presumptive remedy situation.
right. Although I've seen instances where alternative presumptive remedies where we've been able to use on-site control as a very valid mechanism for reducing the depth of the capping elements. It's interesting because you would think that in approving a real electrical permit in a non-presumptive remedy, they'd be able to come to the same conclusion.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's subject to biennial cert, by the way.
Sure, the police.
So you have to interview the police and say, are you still doing your job every 2 years?
Exactly.
The analogy I give is that I could have a cover of sawdust if I have a Marine detachment watching it 24/7.
Yes.
Andy, Steve, some closing remarks?
Sure. I mean, I'm still hopeful. I'm optimistic. I think, I think the LSRP was an improvement to what we had. I think that, LSRPs are continuing to do great work and to exercise professional judgment and to try to push the boundaries of science and practice and, getting contaminated sites cleaned up and redeveloped. So, I'm still an optimist about the program. I'm still an optimist about the use of professional judgment. Administrations and personnel and managers, they sort of come and go, and, the program can evolve. And, I'm happy to be a part of, groups like this that want to try to continue to advance and improve the program. So George, I guess, Phil, George, thank you for putting this together. Thank you for, helping to advance the practice, and, let's keep working on it.
Thanks.
I'll follow suit in the same vein. I think there's a level of optimism that's worthwhile. I do believe that it works most of the time. I do believe that there are still opportunities where the department recognizes professional judgment. I do believe that the working group the LSRPA has had with the department to try to help the remedial action process has helped. I do think, though, that there are still the core issues of the going back to a command and control prescriptive environment too often, not recognizing professional judgments. But LSRPs could do a good job, sometimes a better job, of documenting the basis for it, addressing the department's concerns before the department gets there, speaking the language, saying this is why this is not a bad precedent. And the LSRP should still push the envelope where there's value added for doing so. Following the easy path, if it's relatively cost effective, is still a good practical approach. But where there's that added value of taking an approach, using your professional judgment, being slightly or very creative, you should still do so. And stand by your guns and back up your guns.
Before you close, just real quick, 3 quick points. One is, I say this all the time, document, document, document. More important than ever, as the people you deal with and talk to at the DEP leave, make sure to document it both ways. There's nothing wrong with having a conversation with a DEP employee and sending them an email to confirm that conversation, especially if you've come to an agreement with senior management person, because they may not be there when you submit your document.
Yeah.
So
And I would quickly amend document with justify as part of your documentation.
Right. And maybe then not necessarily with your LSRP hat, but in just the world that we're in right now, you have the environmental justice rules that are out. Make sure you are looking at that. This is not going to be a quiet summer. I'm actually thinking about, like, was it 3 or 4 summers ago? It was crazy. And then there is a emergency rule on the flood hazards area and standards that are hitting on June 10th, because for some reason that has become an emergency in New Jersey to be able, and I'm sure Steve and Andy could probably spend hours on that, but don't be blind to things that are coming out of DEP right now. They're coming out fast and furious, and A901 is still a huge thing that is unresolved. What's happening on July 16th relative to registration, as LSRPs, be on top of everything that is occurring. And last but not least, take care of yourself. We have seen too many young LSRPs over the past 3 years pass away or become very ill. So this is not, I think Steve said, not for the faint at heart, and take care of your heart, because we need to all stay around. So George.
No, I just want to thank everybody. Let me give you my email address if you have any thoughts. Berkowitz@cpesnj.com. Berkowitz@cpes.com. Any thoughts would be appreciated. I'm carrying the flag, folks.
Or just look for your nearest windmill and George will be there.
Everybody be well, stay well. Thanks again for being here. This will be posted on our website. And for all the users getting credit, credit certificates will be out early next week.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Andy, Steve, thanks a lot for your time.
Yeah,
Andy, feel better.
Jules, thank you. Thank you, Jules.
Thanks, Jules.
Bye-bye.